Welcome to the Malcolm Roberts Show. Our aims are to restore our country and our planet for humans to flourish. I want to emphasise that, for humans to flourish. The feedback on our show with Tony Heller last week was overwhelmingly positive. We were stunned with the huge number of views and very, very strongly positive comments. Today will be similar, except that our guest, instead of coming to us from frozen Wyoming, will be with us from North Queensland. First, I want to thank everyone who's watching and listening for having me as your guest in your car, your kitchen, shed, lounge, barbecue, or wherever you are right now, whether it's sitting, standing, driving, walking, running, laying down, exercising, or who knows what. I just remind everyone that our show has two themes: freedom, specifically freedom replacing control, the eternal human struggle, and secondly, responsibility, specifically personal responsibility and integrity. History repeatedly proves that both freedom and responsibility are essential for human progress and for people's livelihoods. I want to welcome and introduce our guest for today. I'm going to ask him his title. He's known as Peter Ridd. He's got a very well-known reputation around the country and an astoundingly high reputation. He's a world-renowned scientist focused for years on our Great Barrier Reef. He's usually quietly spoken, yet when push comes to shove, get out of his way because he does not back down. He's principled, caring, dedicated, and hugely competent. He's respected internationally. He recently took a challenge to the High Court at great emotional cost, and I'll ask him about that. He now works voluntarily so that no one can question his motives because his motives are pure. Welcome, Peter Ridd.
Thanks very much, Malcolm.
Something you appreciate, just anything at all, anything you appreciate.
Lots of things. Nature. I also, I'm a bit crazy about old cars. It's a weakness of mine from the 50s and 60s. But no, I appreciate lots and lots of things. Great music. The truth probably is the thing that I appreciate the most.
I was waiting for you to mention that because there's no doubt about that one. So tell us what your title is, because the other day you said no title. So what was your title and what is your title now?
I used to be Professor of Physics at James Cook University, but after the collapse of the university system, they're so woke and politically correct and failing in so many ways. I've given up on all those sort of academic titles because they don't mean anything. Professor now means nothing. 30 or 40 years ago, a professor would have been a respected person, but nowadays there's too many professors who are second rates, and our university systems has just collapsed in terms of quality. So I don't bother with those types of things now.
Okay, similar to me. I don't go by any status or titles because it's the person we're interested in. So we're not interviewing Professor Peter Ridd, we're interviewing Pete.
No.
Okay, let's get the big one out of the way. High Court, academic freedom, your challenge. Tell us about what happened to you, please, and then how you went to the High Court and how you had a huge upwelling of public support for what you were doing, and then you took it all the way to the High Court.
I've been a scientist on studying the Great Barrier Reef since about 1984 and done an awful lot of work demonstrating that actually the reef was in very good shape, and I was starting to question some of the other stuff coming out of other institutions, plus my own university, and demonstrating complete lack of any quality assurance. The stuff was just not wrong, it was just ridiculously wrong, and clearly nobody was checking. So I basically was saying, where's the quality assurance out of a fellow institute at my university? And they didn't like that, and the university basically told me I had to shut up about it, and I wouldn't shut up about it, and I ended up getting fired. And essentially it was about stuff well within my area of expertise. We ended up going through many levels of legal proceedings, ended up in the High Court, who in a strange decision actually agreed that the university was wrong to sanction me in terms of what I was allowed to say. In other words, I had academic freedom of speech and the university took that away. But because of some of the wording of the work contract, they still had a right to fire me because I broke their confidentiality agreement, which said that so I told the world about their illegal activity And that was illegal itself. So they still had a right to fire me, even though what they did in the first place was completely wrong. So that's just the law. The law is a strange thing. So we won on the principle that the university should never have told me not to say the things that I said, but I ended up losing the job. We ended up getting about $1.5 million of donations, which cost a lot to go to the High Court, from about 10,000 people. It cost me personally, my job plus another 300 grand, so it was fairly expensive. But it was well worth I really don't regret going through that. And in the end, I was probably never going to survive in the university system the way it's been so debased over the last couple of decades.
So let me summarise that. The High Court, the highest court in the land, said that Peter Ridd is free to speak. He has freedom of speech on any topic. And you had the right to speak about these topics. But James Cook University, your employer, can fire you because you're not free to speak in James Cook University.
Well, this is the strange thing about the decision, which I must confess I don't entirely understand the reasoning of the High Court. But anyway, theirs is the last word and I accept it. But yes, in fact, in my work contract, it actually specifically says that I'm allowed to express publicly disagreement with decisions made by the university. You would have thought I would be allowed to express disagreement with the decision to fire me and the decision to sanction me. But apparently, according to the work contract, according to the High Court, I wasn't. So anyway, it's that's just the way it is. It's a strange decision. But as I say, we actually won on the main principle, but I ended up losing the job anyway.
And you actually, the first time you went to the High Court, you actually won, didn't you? Or was that the federal court?
Well, the lower court we won, yes. Then we went down 2-0 in the mid-level court, the federal court, and then we lost in the High Court. And it's interesting that all three decisions were completely different. I mean, the first judge said, no, Ridd has the right of academic freedom. The university was completely wrong. And therefore everything else that follows is pretty well irrelevant. The university should never have done that. They should never have fired him. But then it went higher and it sort of changed backwards and forwards, and the High Court sort of set this halfway thing where the university was wrong, but then they still had a right to silence me about their decisions about me, which is a rather strange thing. I'm not going to criticise the High Court. I think that it was a very strange decision. But I also know the law is a funny thing, and we went in for a principle, and we did get that principle in the end.
Well done. And I've just recently seen an article quoting, it's more to do with COVID and medical matters, but again, establishing freedom of speech for doctors, who have been constrained and squashed in the last 3 years by APRA and others. But in the article that were about the doctors, it quotes extensively from the Peter Ridd High Court case. And the High Court said secrecy hurts. Secrecy basically kills people. And it certainly does, because you have startling evidence, completely backed up, and you're not allowed to present it.
Well, that's right. I mean, in my case, the Great Barrier Reef might not kill very many people, but I tell you, I know a lot of farmers who are accused of killing the Great Barrier Reef, because it's not just climate change, it's also farmers. And they are seriously depressed. If your child comes home from school and you're a farmer and tells you, hey, Dad, you're killing the Great Barrier Reef with all that fertiliser and pesticides, they take that to heart. And, it's not good for their psyche. But, of course, for doctors and say if you were a person at a university maybe working on criminology and the problems of Aboriginal crime in Alice Springs, the fact that you're not allowed to say some things means that there isn't a proper debate, which means that little children are dying, being abused. All these sorts of things are happening in our world because we're not allowed to have a proper debate. And universities is where that is supposed to happen. But in fact, universities should now be called, rather than universities, they should be called monoversities, because there's actually only one idea that's allowed, and that's the politically correct woke idea.
it takes me back to the University of Chicago when I was getting my MBA there. We had a very, very fine professor, Harry Roberts, no relation, but he was a wonderful professor, written many books, an accomplished expert around the world in statistics. And he told us the story about the Challenger explosion. Now, the Challenger explosion was due to an O-ring. And one of the engineers, or several of the engineers in Martin Marietta, I think was the name of the company that built the extra tanks on the side of the Challenger, said Florida had an unusually cold spell. And the engineer said that the O-ring would not survive the cold spell. Do not take off, do not launch while we got the cold spell. And NASA was into face saving, and Martin Marietta didn't want to be embarrassed, so they said launch it. And the thing exploded and killed seven people. So that's a case of suppression due to peer pressure. But what you're talking about is academic freedom. But nonetheless, High Court said that secrecy hurts people. They were the words, I think. Secrecy hurts people. There's a huge cost to secrecy.
It's totally right. I mean, the COVID thing must be the best example of that. There's so much stuff that we are not hearing because doctors are scared to speak. They can be the medical authorities, I don't know what the exact names of them are, can basically strike them off if they say things that the authority doesn't like, and that's just not right. You should have. These are in many cases doctors of tremendous experience, and we should hear what they have to say. And sometimes, in fact, maybe most of the time, some of them are going to be wrong. But that's irrelevant. We need to hear the debate, and then we can decide for ourselves, and the governments can decide for themselves. But the COVID thing will definitely, I think we're going to find in 10 years' time, we're going to look back on it, and we're going to see that a lot of people died unnecessarily, prematurely, because of the secrecy and silencing of debate.
Well, I'm not a female, so I can't multitask, but I just seen an article this morning. If I can get it while I'm doing two things at once, I will try and get it up. But we've seen a wonderful scientist, a medical scientist in the United States, come out and mention everything basically we've been saying for the last 3 years about that. And he's saying they got it wrong. And he said, I was fooled initially, I fooled myself. Now I realize we were completely wrong. And if I can find that, I'll get it up in a minute. But you're famous for exposing unscientific behaviour among scientists assigned to the Great Barrier Reef and standing up despite their baseless smears and lies. And I want to make the point that human progress depends upon sharing ideas. Now, it might be that I come up with a bright idea and I give it to you, and you see it from a different perspective, and you blow it out of all proportion, and you make it a phenomenal idea. And then one of your other colleagues in North Queensland gets your idea, and he can see or she can see how to make money out of it by meeting people's needs. And that's how human progress flourishes, because humans as individuals are highly competent. As groups, we are phenomenally competent. And it's that building off honest sharing of ideas and thoughts, even those who disagree. I remember John Christie, the famous Professor John Christie with the atmospheric temperatures in University of Alabama, Huntsville. I said to him, don't real scientists love being wrong? And he said, absolutely. We love being wrong because it means we're going down the wrong path and someone's picked us up and we're going straight. But that's not what's happening, because you've been criticised by your peers in James Cook University for daring to speak the truth.
Well, yes. I mean, I think actually most scientists, they don't like being wrong. Yes, sort of at a higher plane, it does mean you're going forward. But what actually happens is, although groups are amazing things if they're pointing in the right direction, one of the problems in science is that we actually have groupthink, where there's a stifling of that innovation. And, you know, groups in the past can go awfully off in the wrong direction, as happened in the Second World War in 2 or 3 countries. On the other hand, in a couple of other countries, those groups did wonderful things. So it can work both ways. But that the power of the individual to talk, to expose the wrong idea is so important. In the Great Barrier Reef, where I was talking to, it was just so obvious. I mean, the main thing I was talking about was a reef around an island close inshore, which they were saying was completely destroyed, that there was no coral on it whatsoever.
Is that the one
and
at
I
Bowen?
sent my guys down there. Sorry.
Is that the reef at Bowen?
Yes, at Stone Island at Bowen.
Stone
That's
Island.
right. And I thought this is ridiculous because, the work that I'd done and shown that all these inshore reefs were good, but I thought, well, let's just check. I sent my guys down to check out this reef, and there's staggering coral all around the island. So I said, well, essentially what I said is, look, you got it wrong. I mean, not just a little bit. This is it's not a small reef. It's not a small island. It's not hard to miss. You got it wrong. What I'm interested in is not that you got it wrong, because that's just stating the bleeding obvious. It's what were your quality assurance systems that you were using, because that is the bottom of that problem. That in these scientific institutions, there's not enough quality assurance. Did anybody say, are you really sure that there's no correlation? Maybe we should send a second person down just to make sure. None of that happened. So that was essentially what I was saying. But the groupthink comes in. We must protect the centre. We must protect the God professor who's now being challenged on his quality assurance, get rid of the troublemaker. And unfortunately, this has happened in science, right back to Galileo, I guess, and even Isaac Newton, who is my sort of my favourite scientist, a remarkable fellow. He was terrible at squashing dissenting scientists. Now, we've got to stop that. We've got to allow the dissenters to be able to speak, and that's one of the problems we've got. It's one of the major problems we've got.
Yes, I think it's really important, and it's a crisis in leadership, because that's the fundamental thing that drives or allows the group's values or suppresses the group's values. So, but right now,
I mean, look at all your viewers have probably heard of this system called peer review, where it's more or less the only quality assurance for most of science. And this is the work you do as a scientist. You do the work, and then it goes to a journal, a scientific journal. They send it out to peer review, and most people think that's a check by a dozen scientists, and they redo all the work and do the experiments. But it's not. Just a quick read by a couple of guys who are quite likely wedded to the thing that you're challenging. So if they don't like it, well, then you can't be heard. So the whole system of peer review is just hopeless quality assurance, and it almost guarantees groupthink. And what I've been saying to many politicians, and Malcolm, you're one of the few that gets it, that this is insufficient quality assurance, and we've got to have red teams in here where essentially when a piece of work is going to be used for government policy, whether that's COVID or education or Aboriginal affairs or science of the Great Barrier Reef, that work needs to go through a really serious quality assurance, and that means that you've got to spend a bit of money to do that. And that's just not happening at the moment.
No, it's not.
Has taken over.
No, it's not. And I can remember being a mine manager, with 550 people that I was responsible for. And another mine, one of the earlier mines I managed, with 330 people that I was responsible for. And I remember when I came in on the first day, I said, I want all the management level that reports to me. So I said, here are my expectations. And one of those expectations was, if you can see me about to make a mistake, tell me. I'd rather be told I'm about to make a mistake than I've just screwed up. So, and they get it. And that's extremely important. So, and the rot at James Cook University, and I call it rot, that's stifling science, is due to the leadership of James Cook University. And we can explore that in terms of general academia later. You're working voluntarily now. Why voluntarily?
Well, the reason is that I keep on being accused of being in the pay of the coal industry or the sugar industry or the nuclear industry, which I'm not. I've only ever taken money from my university, or before that, the Australian Institute of Marine Science. And it's, I've got a bit of superannuation. I'm financially okay. And it's worth $1 million to me to be able to say to people, no, I'm not in the pay. So recently we had a big Senate inquiry, and Senator Carr, the Labor senator, on his big high seat in the Senate there, those inquiries, looked down at me and said, and who pays you? And I was able to look him in the eye and say, nobody pays you, stick that up your pipe basically. Nobody pays me at all, because whenever they do that, they're impugning my integrity as though I'm doing it. But whereas all the other people he had in front of him were being paid by the government, whether they're scientists who are paid by the government, I was the only one who was actually truly independent. So it's worth a lot to me to be able to deflect that criticism, because it's so easy for people to say, oh, he doesn't believe in the climate change thing because Exxon or somebody like that is paying him. Well, I tell you, those fossil fuel companies are not paying anybody. I'm still waiting for the phone call from Exxon to say, oh, we want you to tell a lies, here's $1 million. It just doesn't happen. But people don't know that, so the only way I can do this is to be completely squeaky clean, no money from anybody. I work with the IPA. They actually offered me a position, a paying position. I said, no, I'll just do it for nothing. And that means that I can always say I'm independent.
Right, and the same thing happened to me when I was project leader of the Galileo movement. The founders of the Galileo movement, 2 directors, said, okay, they offered me that position. I'd said I'd take it on 2 conditions. One is that you do not pay me for the same reason that you said. And secondly, that we explore not only the science, but the corruption of science by the United Nations, the CSIRO, the Bureau of Meteorology. And they were delighted, of course, but they were good people to work with. So you've... And the other thing I want to draw out there for anyone listening or watching is that you've been accused of those taking money when you didn't. That indicates to me that your accusers realized they had no argument to defeat you. So when they have no argument, they then use a spurious lie. If they had the argument and the data, they would have used it, and you would have said, oh, okay, I'm wrong, and away you go. But no, they instead told a lie.
Well, exactly. I mean, on the Great Barrier Reef, it's quite remarkable how they never, ever, ever debate me. So I've challenged them to debate. We challenged them to have a big debate here in Townsville. I asked all the big scientific institutions. We got it all lined up. Nobody turned up, right? So they don't want to debate the actual scientific arguments. So it's very easy just to say, no, you're corrupt. You take money from the whatever industry, and we don't now have to argue. But this is cancel culture.
Yes.
We just cancel you. You're an evil person. Therefore, we do not have to engage in an argument, which suits them. But you can tell for sure that you're on very solid ground when these people will not debate you. You know, I mean, I'm often, well, I always are very, very doubtful. Am I right here? Am I actually got it right? But one of the things that makes me think that maybe I am right is that they won't argue with me. That's actually a pretty good sign.
Right, and it's very important to understand that science involves debate. That's how you stretch ideas. That's how you test ideas. So science is very much about presenting the data, presenting your algorithms, presenting your computer code so that people can scrutinize it. And it's your duty as a scientist, if you've come up with a new discovery, to put all your data, all your information in the hands of people who disagree with you, because the first duty of a scientist is to be a skeptic, to challenge you. And only when they've exhausted themselves and can't challenge you anymore, and they say, well, Professor Ridd, you are correct, and your theory then stands and your science stands. But that's not what's happening.
No, it's certainly not what's happening. And as I say, the group takes over. We won't argue. We won't often release the data. I mean, Jennifer Marahasi, the famous climate skeptic who I've worked with for many years, she's in the next couple of days going to be in court trying to get data out of the Bureau of Meteorology on the comparison between the old type temperature probes and the modern electronic temperature sensors, because they don't always read the same, you see. And they won't release the data. And now this is just completely against the whole scientific principle. You have to release everything so people can study it. But then actually you've got to go more than that. You actually need to employ people to try to criticise it. The Bureau should, rather than being stonewalling against Jennifer, they should actually be employing her, actually paying her and saying, hey, Jennifer, we know you're against us, so you're actually the ideal person to find if we've done anything wrong.
So that straight away leads me to conclude, and we know this is correct because of their behaviour in the past, that the Bureau of Meteorology is hiding something, hiding the corruption of the data. They call it homogenisation. It is nothing short of tampering, as deceitful, dishonest tampering, unscientific tampering. So you've now changed your life. You're working voluntarily because science is so important. Why is science so important?
Well, I think everybody realises, that so much of what we have today relies on the technological advances. those technological advances couldn't have happened before the sort of the Enlightenment ideas that allowed people to challenge the edicts that came in those early days when the church wasn't quite so enlightened. And it allowed science to flourish. It allowed people to have what were crazy ideas and to be listened to. It's given us everything that we've got. So I'm a scientist through and through. I've more or less always been a scientist my whole life, and that's why I see this corruption in the science, which has become far worse in the last 30 or 40 years, as such a tragic thing that although technological advances are going ahead still relatively rapidly, even there I think groupthink is restricting the full potential. And when you come to science as applied to the environment, it's just almost totally corrupted. And now we're seeing it even creeping into things like medicine. It's a tragedy.
Well, I know you're going to agree with this, but that's not to preempt it. But you've just said that these things, looking around the building, plane travel, is all due to science. Science explored the metals, explored the energy. They came up with things that we could use. Science is about understanding nature. I get that, because nature is basically unlocking everything when we interrogate it with science. But to me, science gave us something, I won't say more important, but just as important, and that is science gave us freedom. Because up until the advent of the scientific method, it was the biggest muscle, the biggest troops, the biggest financial, the wealthiest owners, the most scary religious freak, the most powerful politicians. These are the people who stood over us as humans and controlled us. And we succumbed to that. Then when the scientific method came out, we said, hang on a minute, this is the objective data, and it says the opposite of what you're saying. And that brought objectivity into it, and that brought freedom of expression. I tell you, science, the scientific method and objectivity that it brought, I think is hugely important just in its own right, not just for the material wealth.
I think you're right there, especially the point about freedom. Because if you go back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, you had the aristocracy and you had basically the serfs, almost slaves.
Yep.
In England, white slaves. Essentially, they just worked for a pittance. And the scientific method gave us people like James Watt and various other people who were able to invent these machines. And suddenly you had this middle class of people who were basing their inventions essentially on science, and they then become more important than even the aristocracy. And they brought people out of poverty. They gave them that freedom. So you're absolutely right that science has given us freedom, which never existed anywhere virtually before about 1800.
And now we've got the cancel culture come back, which is the same as the old religions, the old feudal barons, the robber barons, the same people who wanted to control, and that's what they're doing now. So tell us about your life journey. Where were you born and how did you get to where you are now?
Oh,
you're a bloody Pommy, aren't you?
I'm English, yes, and I was spent quite a bit of my early life in Nigeria, which means I guess I'm guilty of all sorts of things which I never did, like slavery and the Industrial Revolution and those sorts of things. So I'll plead guilty to all of those. I came over to Australia, lived in North Queensland, so I regard myself as a North Queenslander. Went to school there and essentially been there ever since. Ended up working did a physics degree, so I'm a physicist. Ended up working at the Australian Institute of Marine Science. People think marine science is all about biology. It's not. It's physics, there's chemistry, there's geology, and in fact all the climate change stuff that affects the Great Barrier Reef, you need to understand the physics. And we did a lot of work, technological work. So we invented the instruments for measuring sediment concentrations out on coral reefs for long periods, and quite a few other sort of technological advancements in science.
So tell us about some of the inventions, because you're credited with at least one invention that's known around the world and used around the world. Tell us about that and some of the other inventions.
Well, one of the problems is that farmers and various dredgers were accused of killing the coral from the mud coming off the land. So there are various systems of measuring the muddiness of water, but they didn't work very well for more than about a day or so. We managed to extend that out with just very simple mechanical means, actually, to be able to take measurements out there in the ocean for many months, and that then gave us a complete new window on how sediment reaches the reef, and we were able to demonstrate that farmers had absolutely no effect whatsoever on the Great Barrier Reef. But there are other things we worked for, various technological developments in mines, which you'd know about, basically deep hard rock mines, the paste pipes, the wear in those. We also were using satellite drifters to track currents down rivers. There's lots and lots of things which we worked on in that time.
Right, and you mentioned that farmers had no impact on the Great Barrier Reef. I was on a Senate inquiry here in Brisbane. I don't know if you were there that day, but
I was there and I watched you in action, Malcolm. It was great to watch.
and the point, and we had another Liberal senator also doing a really good job of interrogating these guys, and I can remember the state government relied upon certain scientists, and they had nothing. They were stripped naked. No. They're absolutely naked. And we've got whole communities in central Queensland, northern Queensland, even Bundaberg's really southern Queensland, borderline central, just being destroyed. The agriculture, the farmers being destroyed, the communities being destroyed because of lies based upon no evidence whatsoever, and in fact, contradicting the evidence.
Well, that's right. There's lots of evidence that contradict what these supposed scientists were saying. I mean, they claim that pesticides are killing the Great Barrier Reef or damaging the Great Barrier Reef, and yet when the concentrations are so low on the Great Barrier Reef, you can't even measure them with the most ultra sensitive scientific equipment. And it was wonderful, Malcolm, to watch that Senate inquiry when you and Gerard Rennick and I think Matt Canavan maybe was there as well.
Susan
take
McDonald.
them apart, because that was the first time I'd seen them challenged, and to watch their faces when they were asked questions which exposed the total fallacy of what they were saying. That was the first time that had happened. I think it rattled them quite significantly. If we could only have that happen again and again and again, the whole shibboleth of this farmers are killing the Great Barrier Reef would just fall over so quickly.
It would, but the telling factor there is that we destroyed the scientists' argument, showed that they had no argument whatsoever. They were not pushing the science. They were not following the science. But the real damage now is that the corrupt Palaszczuk government is continuing despite the fact that we've exposed that. And they just turn a blind eye to it, because it's not about science anymore. It's about paying someone with a science name around him or her to do whatever the politicians want. That's the way science is now distorted.
That's exactly right. And if you go to, say, the Australian Institute of Marine Science and you did an opinion poll, how many do you reckon would vote for Greens and the left wing of the Labor Party? It would be the overwhelming majority. So you've got an ideological science base. I won't call it, it's not really science, actually, pseudoscience base. And they can be guaranteed to paper over the cracks, and they're just not little cracks, they're massive cracks in their so-called science, and deliver up to their sycophants in the government. It's not just Labor governments, because even the last federal Liberal national government was not particularly good on challenging the Great Barrier Reef science when they had the opportunities. Sure, people like Gerard Rennick have been wonderful, as have Matt Canavan, but the government itself was very, very weak on challenging stuff which they must know is wrong. But you've got to give them, you've got to understand that they know that those scientific organisations are very, very powerful. If the CSIRO says, Scott Morrison, you're going against the science, the farmers are killing the reef, this is what we say because we're the scientists and we're the gods, then Scott Morrison has to basically know where the power really is, and it wasn't with him. So we have a fundamental problem, and politicians are going to have to stand up to this. But you see, I'm saying at the moment, one of the things we've got this wonderful statistic where the Great Barrier Reef has never had more coral than it has this year. And this is a God-given opportunity for us to say, Well, we've got more coral than we've had since forever, despite 4 massive bleaching events in just the last 6 years, which supposedly killed most of the reef. This proves without a shadow of doubt these institutions are not just a little bit wrong, they're utterly wrong. And we need some, a root and branch clear out there, audit, find out what's going on, because they're untrustworthy.
You mentioned a few names there, and I'm going to take Scott Morrison. I don't believe Scott Morrison at all is intimidated by the CSIRO. I believe the CSIRO is intimidated by the governments of the day. I've forgotten the name of the prominent head research scientist, chief research scientist, Garth Paltridge, atmospheric scientist. He said that CSIRO has just become a slave to the governments. So whatever crap the governments are peddling, ideology the governments are peddling, CSIRO just endorses. And we can see that in climate, we can see it in energy. They're peddling complete crap to back up the lies that the governments are telling.
I don't agree with that, actually. I think if you had a slightly right-wing, right-of-centre government that said, we want to audit the science because we have some reservations, I think you could just about guarantee that the CSIRO would erupt in, an anti-Trumpian type, way that the civil service does all over the world. But it would be a massive feat for them to do that. And even if the government of the day threatened to take their funding away from them, I think that you would still see a massive fight away from this ideological left mindset that completely pervades huge amounts of the CSIRO and the other. So I think I disagree with that. I can see where you're getting, but I think I disagree, at least in detail, on that.
Well, we've disagreed in the past, and we'll continue to disagree, and that's wonderful about freedom of speech. I'm going to take you to something that I got from Senator McAllister, who was the minister representing the Minister for Energy and Climate Change in the Senate when the government was debating the Climate Change Bill 2022, 3rd of September. I asked her for the logical scientific points, which means the empirical data within a logical framework that proves cause and effect. That logical scientific point needs to show that carbon dioxide from human activity is a threat to us and needs to be cut. Okay, so you can't get any clearer than that. That's it. So she came back a few hours later, tabled a speech she gave in 2016 in which she listed 20 papers and then added another scientific papers, and then she listed another 5. So what I've done is that I've read all 25 of those papers. The titles, tell me what's wrong with this, Peter. Here are the titles of some of the papers. Now remember, I'm asking for cause and effect. I'm looking for the cause. These are some titles. Biological response to climate change on a tropical mountain. What's wrong with that?
Oh, yeah.
You don't need to do any more.
No, exactly. But this is so much, this so-called climate change. We take a possum, we cook it, and it falls out of the tree, and then we say, because the climate change is going to get hotter, all the possums are going to fall out of the tree. And, and as you say, but maybe the temperature's not going to get much warmer, or maybe the temperature is going to get warmer naturally because it has done in the past lots and lots of times, and that's where your cause and effect goes in. So anything that starts with the word response, as you rightly suggest, is not a good start as an answer to your question. So
this is a policy that's going to cost us trillions. I mean, literally trillions of dollars in economic opportunity. Going to destroy manufacturing, destroy our energy sector, where Australia should have the cheapest in the world. It's going to destroy our competitiveness. And she does not even know the difference between cause and response. The second is another paper, predicting the impacts of climate change on the distribution of species.
Another one. So we presume that, this is it. But it's interesting. I was just looking at, I can't remember what I was looking at just yesterday. It was a new paper that's come out, more doom. And they were talking about this data, this climate data. I thought, that's interesting. So I looked it up in detail. It wasn't even data. It was the output of the models, which they were calling data. So it's a house built on sand, and the sand is sitting on a swamp. It's just it's such sloppy science, but this is all pervasive now. It's just part of the perversion and corruption within the system.
The IPCC uses models because they haven't got any logical scientific points based on empirical data. They use models, and I've read in their sole chapter in each of the last four reports they've given on the science, the sole chapter says they refer to data, and they literally mean the output from models.
Yeah.
It's bullshit.
Yeah, that's terrible stuff. And also, to me, the biggest thing that they don't look at is the natural variability in the climate. When the Egyptians were building pyramids, it was probably a degree or so hotter than it is today, with ease. The Sahara Desert used to have huge lakes in it just a few thousand years ago. This is monumental climate change, which happens entirely naturally, and all this is just sort of glossed over. Greenland was called Greenland because it was green. It's not green yet. Maybe it will be good if it becomes green, but it's not green yet. So this is another area where I think the IPCC, the over-reliance on models and the almost complete ignorance or ignorance of the geological and historical record.
So I didn't even ask for this. So 9 of her 20 papers, she gave me 20 papers in one list plus another 5. 9 of those 20 in the first list have got cause and effect mixed up. She is telling me about the effects of the claimed climate change, not the cause. So yeah. She's hopeless. But the second thing, she volunteered this in a speech in 2016. She said, quote, "Here are the 20 most cited peer-reviewed papers about climate change and its effects." Wait for it, Peter. Compiled by Thomson Reuters, the news agency, and that expressed a view on climate. So this is not science. This is a list of 20 papers that were most cited and discussed and expressed a view on climate change. No scientific evidence or logic anywhere in those 20 or the other 5.
Yeah. This appeal to the consensus is a real scary thing. I think Einstein said when a group of Nazi scientists all banded together and said that Einstein was wrong about relativity, and Einstein responded to say, "Why 100? If I'm wrong, only 1 will do." And when Einstein came out with his 5 remarkable papers in 1905, there was just him against the rest of the scientific community, and he was right. So this appeal to authority, the appeal to the numbers, the failing to argue, is all a good sign that the whole scientific system is utterly corrupted.
Yep, and it's been politicized, and now we get scientists depending upon for a living on research grants which are doled out by politicians who say, "Mate, you'll get this grant if you come up with this conclusion."
Well, but see, this is where I disagree. It's not actually doled out by politicians. It's doled out by a bureaucracy which is infected by extreme left-wing ideology, whether it's the Australian Research Council or the National Science Foundation, especially in things like climate change. Do you think there would be any chance that, because I've tried, to get a research grant from the Australian Research Council that challenged the narrative on climate change and the Great Barrier? Not a chance. This is well before it ever gets up to a minister.
That's a good point, but ultimately the grants, the ideology comes from the United Nations, World Economic Forum, one of those organisations, and that's been politically powerful on our politicians as well. So the politicians turn a blind eye to it all. You're right. It's not just the politicians who hand out the grants, but it is the politicians who endorse the expenditure on those grants. And so, but the grants are actually given by woke institutions that have been corrupted ideologically. Yeah, I agree.
I'm not excusing the politicians, not even a little bit. But, so that I think we are in agreement.
Yeah. So here are the 25 papers. I've been through the lot. This is what's stands as science in our entity. 9 of the 20 talk about effects, not cause. Many of the cited papers do not discuss causation of climate variability. Do not even discuss it. So why did she offer them as proof of causation? One paper, get this, Peter, one paper specifically questions whether climate variability is due to humans or is natural. So why did she offer that as proof? Another paper...
That's probably the best paper actually, because, how do we know?
Another paper reinforces natural oscillations driving climate variability and admits that climate drivers are poorly understood and questions whether human activity drives climate. Why did she offer that? 11,
that's crazy. It's beautiful.
11 of her 20 papers and 3 of the additional 5 papers rely on numerical models, not empirical scientific evidence. Why does she offer these as empirical evidence? So, Thomson Reuters, she gets it from a corrupted news entity. So I could have a lot of fun with that, but we'll go on to something else that's important because we're 15 minutes left to go. I'd like you to talk about how to fix this, specifically your Office of Scientific Integrity, that's now One Nation policy, Office of Scientific Integrity, and you add the words, and quality assurance. Tell us about that and why it's so crucial.
Well, essentially, I break science up into 3 types. There's the science, that we go off and we measure a butterfly and we look at its wings and we report on it. It's all very interesting, but nobody's never going to use it. So actually, if the work was wrong, it doesn't actually matter too much. Then there's work that will ultimately be used by industry, and the industry will check that, otherwise they'll go broke, so we don't need to worry about that too much. But then there's the stuff that's used by governments, like climate change science, Great Barrier Reef science, COVID science. And if we are going to rely just on peer review, and we know that on average, peer-reviewed work is wrong 50% of the time wrong, then if
that's in medicine too, Peter. That's in medicine.
Oh yeah. No, and that's not controversial, by the way. That's not just Peter Rich saying that. This is completely. Everybody knows this is true, right?
That was published an article on that very topic, establishing that 50% of peer review is wrong, was published as a peer-reviewed article in The Lancet, the British Journal of Medicine.
Yes, that's right. Which is a funny thing that it's peer reviewed. But so we know peer review is rubbish quality assurance. So if we're going to use this work for government policy, then the government has an obligation to do better quality assurance. And what I think we need is what's called a red team. In the military, they always used to worry that, nobody wants to say no to the general, that it's a really bad idea to go off and invade Poland. We don't think you should do it for all these reasons. Well, we're not going to say that because the general will probably shoot us if we say that, so we just go off and we invade Poland, right? And that's a disaster. So in military, they like to have a red team where there's a way for a person to formally say, look, I really think you're a wonderful general and all the rest of it, but this is my argument against it. And that's been working in the military. We need that in science. We need a proper challenge. And one way to do that is to have an independent body, and that's where the problem with this idea is, that will automatically challenge. So this Office of Science Quality Assurance is one idea. The worry is that it will get hijacked by exactly the same guys who are causing the problem in the first place. I also think there needs to be a budget line set aside by the Minister of Agriculture or the Ministry of Environment, so that the minister themselves can decide to do some quality assurance checks. Now, half the time that will be done by a crazy minister, and we won't be any further ahead than we are now. Frankly, we can't be worse than what we are now because we don't have any quality assurance. But some of the time you'll get a good minister, it might be somebody like Matt Canavan, or never know, might be you next time, Malcolm, and we'll get some proper quality assurance done, because at least politicians are accountable to the people, whereas most of these bureaucrats are utterly non-accountable.
Well, there's another. So first of all, you set up if you're pushing the science and you have the scientists backing that science, and you're pushing that as the basis of policy, then you set up another entity, a blue team, that says, and you give the blue team proper funding, and their one job is to tear apart and destroy the red team's argument scientifically. So
that's right. I think it's the other way around. I think the red team tries to destroy, but it doesn't matter.
Yeah, it doesn't matter.
Exactly
one team.
That's the principle. Yeah.
And that, spending that money on tearing it apart, is not a waste of money because, first of all, if the policy goes ahead without scrutiny, it could be trillions of dollars blown, just like we're seeing with the energy sector now. But if you actually have even just fine-tuning the what is the policy-based science, what is the science-based policy, then you've already paid for that team to exist.
Exactly. I mean, well, on the reef, I estimate you could, if you spent $5 million, $10 million max, you could basically do a proper quality assurance check on all the important science, right? We're spending hundreds of millions of dollars every year on the Great Barrier, probably close to $1 billion every year if you add it all up, right? Because there's so many pots of money. I remember, I think it was somebody at the Australian Institute of Marine Science, when I put up this idea, said, "Oh no, we don't have enough money to do quality checks." Now, can you imagine Toyota or Boeing saying, "We don't have enough money to do quality checks, and our plane crashes half the time"? But this is what you get in science. The Australian Research Council, I think, should set aside 5 to 10% of their money to do replication, testing stuff. It's actually against the funding rules for the Australian Research Council. Because I made an application to the Australian Research Council to do replication tests on some extant research. Came back and said against funding rules. And they're right. They knocked me back and they were right. It's against rules, and it's still against the funding rules. So there's this incredible resistance to check and do proper quality assurance. And this is yet another example of where there's demonstrating that the whole scientific edifice, the institutions, is utterly corrupted. They won't even check themselves.
Yes, and you can have a corrupt computer disk, which is corrupt due to some malfunction. So when we talk about corruption in science, sometimes it is bribery, sometimes it is financial corruption. I get that. But sometimes it's just a misdirection of the science and group speak, which is no one really trying to do this. But they're still corrupting the science.
It's corrupted. It's willful negligence, right? Mostly it's not fraud. It's not paper. There is quite a lot of fraud, by the way. And I've exposed quite a bit of stuff that is so close to fraud, maybe it's not fraud, but but most of it is
there is fraud in science.
Yeah, there's a lot, but mostly it's willful negligence. If you fail to check something when you know you should check it, and that goes wrong, and people dies or too much money is spent, then you are willfully negligent, and that is just as bad as if you pulled the trigger yourself.
Yep.
It's willful negligence. I've told them that you don't have enough quality assurance on Great Barrier Reef science, they then stick their heads in the sand, shoot the messenger basically. Now you're willfully negligent, and that's a form of corruption.
Yes, I had this down to talk about later, ways of corrupting. You can have poor data, poor scientific processes that are not really scientific. Secondly, you can have funding that leads to compromises or lies or fraud. Thirdly, you can have the use of logical fallacies. Like Dr. Larry Marshall, in my opinion, used a lot of appeals to authority. In response to some of my questions, he says, but CSIRO is in the top 1% of scientific bodies. That just shows that he can't answer my question, but he's got a very smooth way of doing it. That, to me, when you use a logical fallacy, is a corruption of science. So these are corrupting our science. The other point that I wanted to mention on your Office of Scientific Integrity and Quality Assurance, there's nothing wrong with having a very simple edict in Parliament or in government that says if you claim as a minister that your policy and your legislation is based on science, post the bloody science. Let the people of Australia tear it apart, because people think that you can only tear apart science if you've got a BSc after your name. That's rubbish. No. You have got some of the smartest people, the most logical people, the most inquisitive people who have got no scientific formal qualifications but act scientifically. And a lot of them are engineers. But you get the people of Australia to tear that policy apart, and you get sensible questions, you get some rubbish questions. But at the end of the day, you get far better science.
I totally agree. It should be much more transparent than it is. They claim it's transparent, but it isn't. And but more than just release it, you actually need to employ people to tear it apart.
Yes.
And what you can do things like, all right, we've got this bit of work on the Great Barrier Reef. We're going to employ 3 people to tear it apart. Professionals like auditors in accountancy. And by the way, to you 3, we're not going to tell who you all 3 are, but if you miss something that the other people find is wrong, then we're not going to employ you again. So you really put pressure on these auditors to make sure if there's a statistical problem, you better find it, otherwise you'll be out of a job next time. So it is important. This is quality assurance. In every other industry, whether it's coal like you are, that coal has got to come out with a certain fraction of this and a certain fraction of less than that of rock in the coal. There's quality assurance standards there. They just almost don't exist in the scientific world. It's just unbelievable how slack it is, and that's got to change.
Yep. So I try to get onto solutions at the end of the conversation because I want my podcast to be positive. We discuss a lot of problems, but we've got solutions. You've already talked about the main solution, but I want to give you an opportunity. I get so caught up in this, I want to rush and try to cram it all in. We can't do it, so I'm going to be more disciplined. How can people connect with you, with your work? Is it through social media?
Yes, I've got a YouTube channel called Reef Rebels. We've actually put up some new sort of super duper videos on that. And I've got a Facebook page. It's the Dr. Peter Ridd Facebook page. That's the best way to see what I'm doing. But the Reef Rebels YouTube channel is where I'm putting up all the stuff about the Great Barrier Reef. And that will have basically a series of 15 videos done by the middle of this year. There's 4 or 5 up there at the moment, and they will go up every 2 to 3 weeks. And
you've also got a book called Reef Heresy?
Yep, book called Reef Heresy. Nobody reads books anymore, but for those people who still do. By Connor Court. And that essentially lays out my argument why the Great Barrier Reef is actually in just wonderful condition. We should always worry about the Great Barrier Reef, but we shouldn't worry too much because all the news is actually pretty good.
When you say worry, you don't mean be scared of what's happening. What you're saying is be concerned about making sure we monitor the Barrier Reef because, as you just said, it is in wonderful shape.
Exactly. It's a bit like, if you're a parent and your child is top of the class in school, wins all their sports things and plays the violin at 7th grade, you're still going to worry about her or he, okay? Yeah. No matter how good or well she's doing. But, you do need to also look at this logically and say things are actually not too bad.
Okay, and I understand you're on Facebook if people want to message you?
Yeah, okay. That's right. So Facebook, the Dr. Peter Ridd one is the best one, not the Peter Ridd one. That's a private one, which I never use. The Dr. Peter Ridd Facebook one is the best one. Dr.
Peter Ridd for Facebook for messaging Peter. Reef Rebels on YouTube. Reef Heresy is the book. You're making a series of videos with the IPA and also later for the Global Warming Policy Foundation. Look, it's almost time to go. We've covered most of the topics I had. We've covered all of them just about. Any main messages from you? We've got 2 minutes.
The most important thing, 2 words that people have got to keep saying are the words quality assurance, because that is at the bottom of our scientific problem, whether it's climate or COVID. The scientific systems are fundamentally deficient of those quality assurance systems, and that's what needs to be fixed.
And the best way of quality assurance is to open it up to cross-examination. And you think, and I agree with you, and we've endorsed your policy, is to fund an alternative agency or group of people to actually interrogate and try to destroy the scientific argument that is at the basis of policy.
Yep, there's scientific auditors. So in accounting, we have auditors that go around, make mongrels of themselves, checking the books. We need a bunch of scientists to go around basically checking stuff and trying to find what's wrong. And whatever's left, we can assume is right.
Well, I want to sign off now, Peter. First of all, I want to thank you so much for appearing on our show. But more importantly, I want to thank you for the years of work you've done investing in science for the benefit of human progress and freedom, and especially your standing up to the corruption at James Cook University in the sciences. That is such a wonderful thing. You have given a lot of people in our country hope, and you've given us a lot of good tips and directions we should go politically. Our objective now is to make sure that those are implemented, and we'll be fighting very hard to do that. But above all, thank you so much for what you're doing. Thank you so much for the way in which you're doing it, and keep going.
Thanks, Malcolm, and thanks for your support over the last few years too.